children and yourself, and how down
Welcome to another week of The Obligation. My name is Jason Murphy. Here we go. Another week, another conversation, another set of questions. Just a simple guy asking some simple questions in a complex church and world environment. So we're about second week into the excommunications of the Society of St. Pius X. A lot of struggling going on with Catholics, a lot of opinions. Again, I am not a scholar, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a canon lawyer. I am just a simple guy in the pew. The society is continuing to operate as usual. Of course, they're taking hits, online, pretty vicious, but it's vicious both ways. I can tell you I've been attacked. I'm not here to ride on any bandwagon. I'm not here to say I 100% support what the society did. I completely understand what they did. I am sympathetic and empathetic to what they have done. I'm not smart enough to really comprehend the depth of it. There's enough very intelligent, very holy people on both camps that are going to provide every, theological argument or canon law citation to argue where they stand. For me, I feel like I am in the middle. I don't feel like I'm compromising. I feel like I'm holding the ground. I am supporting what the society is working to support and sustain as best I can in my limited capability. And I'm also going to support local priests that I know are doing the hard work, and local faithful that are struggling and just as confused as I am or you are. It's a difficult time in the church. It's always been a difficult time in the church. We know the gates of hell shall not prevail, so we do know that. But we do know that there's going to be trial. But that's a good thing. When a fire happens in a forest, or when farmers set their fields, it has to do damage. It has to break down before it can rebuild. And I think even humanly speaking, we need the same. We become conditioned and lazy and complacent to what we need. And sometimes it takes a smack on the head. Sometimes it takes hitting the brick wall. Sometimes it takes going through tough things to realize how small we are and how big God is. I know that for me personally, there's times in my life, maybe yesterday, maybe last week, probably next week, probably maybe later today, I'm going to hit a brick wall. I'm going to think that I know what the answer is, think I'm doing the right thing. And God, in his divine providence, in his ultimate goal of getting me to heaven, is going to provide necessary correction tools and guiding, to the better decision, to the better life. So I think that is happening to the church. I think that it's shaken up. Some will say that we took the new ability to have Latin Mass by some more pontificum, that it was taken for granted. Who knows? Maybe. I don't know. But we all do know that the beginning of all sin is pride. Every sin initiates through pride, through an act of selfishness, choosing to do my will rather than God's will. And you could trace back to even, I've heard arguments, the 1950s, 1950s, the peak of, say, the Catholic Church, in its growth, in its numbers, in its faithful. But was it taken for granted? We don't know. Me personally, I would say yes. I would say there were probably the best times, our nation, especially here, probably the golden age of the United States in the 1950s, after the Second World War, and just great national honor, and people lost a lot of lives, a lot of family members. So anytime you have that, you have a return to God, return to church, return to faith. So maybe it was a perfect storm in the 1950s of truly falling back to to what's important. And, who knows? Was it squandered? What did the 1950s teach us? Only history can tell. We were at the height of all sorts of technologies and economy and, economic growth and in ingenuity, invention, and all these things. And after the 1950s, 1960s, even technology just started quadrupling and doubling, exponentially. What we learned from the 1950s to today exponentially was established and developed, compared to what, the previous 200 years, 500 years of existence. So was that a correction? Did the 1960s, did Vatican II come at that time? It was a perfect storm. It was free love. It was, maybe we had it all, we took it for granted. It's like, our Lord says, it is harder for a rich man to enter into heaven than for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle. And anytime we start to believe that we are the creators of our own destiny and we are the means to all of our ends, we overlook and we overstep God. And out of his love and mercy, he always pursues us. He's always pursuing us. Even when we ignore him, even when we think he's not there and we've supposedly turned our back on him, he is right there. And for anyone who has children, you know the same. You will relentlessly pursue your child out of love. It's hard, very difficult to raise children. It's very difficult to remember, that it is our goal to pursue them relentlessly, but that's what we do. And that's what God does. If we pursue in such a manner for the salvation of our children, of the well-being, physical, mental, spiritual well-being of our children, how much more God, who is infinitely perfect. So when we speak of, this rich man entering into heaven, let's look at our country in the 1950s. Let's look at the church in the 1950s. Were we so abundantly rich that we began thinking and overlooking how important God was? Did faith and church become cultural at that point? We had so much. World War II accomplished, the growth of our country, our economy, world, I hate to say world domination, but world notability. And just kind of similar where, perhaps we may or may not be right now, thinking we're on top of the world, militarily, economically, security-wise. But yes, from a bird's eye perspective, 10,000 foot, look down, yeah, that might look pretty good, but what's boots on the ground? Where is abortion in our country? Where is pornography in our country? Where is homosexuality and gay pride in our country? Are we in a similar situation? Are we in a deservingly shake-up realm? I don't know. Those are just questions. Looking at history, looking at humanity, looking at the condition of sinful man and what we default to. We tend to default to inwardly. When we fold inwardly, we obviously aren't looking outwardly towards God. And I can tell you in my own personal life that there was a time in my life where I think that was a temptation for me. I'd become very successful in business, had respect and influence in leading men and in the church and cute little family and all of these things. And from the 10,000 foot perspective, things looked like they were quite perfect. They could have looked quite perfect. And interiorly, I was going through difficult times. I was questioning a lot of things, dealing with a lot of resentments in my life. And this was far after my reversion back to the faith. This is into my 40s, unresolved, issues that I've never dealt with. Successful business, replacing my true happiness, perhaps, maybe on that road, maybe that deviation, that slight, small degree of deviation that you don't pay attention to if you're sailing across the ocean and you move that that rudder 1 degree, it's not very noticeable. But over time, that 1 degree or 2 degrees can be catastrophic. It can be so detrimental that over a long period of time, you could be going in the exact opposite direction that you thought you were going over a longer period of time. And so I think for me, that happened. And as I was maybe not as settled, foundationally secure in my faith, questioning things, but on the outside, business was good. I was able to absorb myself into being busy and being accomplished and being respected, perhaps. And that small degree could quickly, start to turn on you. I hadn't abandoned my faith. I hadn't stopped going to Mass. I started excusing myself a lot more. I wasn't praying intentionally, that's for sure. And I was not there for my family. And you can see the small breakdown of that and how it all works together. And that's how the enemy works. He does the same thing. The distractions, the breakdown, the small little steps away from the path. Before you know it, you're definitely off track. Was the church there? I don't know. Excommunication itself it's a corrective action by the church. In its definition, it's an act of to help the Catholic back. It's not an act of vindication against that Catholic. It's an act, you could say, out of love. Because if we correct our own children out of love, our children aren't going to like it. When God corrects us out of love, a lot of times we don't like it. It's against our will. It's against our lower cravings. It's against what we want. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's a job promotion. Maybe it's any number of things. Someone becomes ill. You become ill. A death of someone. God allows these things to draw us back, to see where our heart is, where our treasure is stored. Because if it's not stored in Him, it's likely stored in something else, or it's being stored in something else, and God will reach out to us. So, I can't tell you about the excommunication. There is so much conversation. I'm not trying to get on the bandwagon with that. I'm just asking questions. I'm just considering what it is, what it looks like, what the reasoning was. Why is the church in the state it is? Why are things so confusing? For me, in my life, in different situations, when there's not a clear answer, a clear explanation, for me, it's usually something nefarious. It's usually something that is probably not good. If it's not clear to us, it can, and a lot of times, be something that just, when it just doesn't make sense, when you just can't put your finger on it, when cooler heads prevail and you just can't find what that answer is. I'm not saying that ignorance is that situation. Certainly there's ignorance, and you can be ignorant of information. And maybe I'm very ignorant right now, so I know there's enough people online that have told me that, and I understand, and I'll admit it. I am ignorant. There's a lot of things I don't know. I'm just trying to find my way as well. So, was the church in that position in the 1950s when Vatican II came along? Was God wanting to shake things up? Was He wanting to correct things? Correct the hearts primarily. I'm not saying that the Mass or the liturgy or anything needed to be corrected. I don't know. I am way outside of my level to make a statement of that. I can only look at the fruits of things. The apparent fruits. Some fruits aren't as noticeable. Were the same things happening in the 1950s? I think it was priming them, it was being primed for the 1960s. We could certainly see the free love movement of the 1960s, the modernistic, the liberalization of our church, of our politics. You can see that. So when you can see that, you can naturally deduce that it was there and it was infiltrating and it was coming to the surface. What led to that I don't know. What I think maybe what led to that was, I think everyone there wasn't we'd been through so much in the Second World War, um, that it was finally a time of new birth, growth and renewal in our country, growth and renewal in the world as a whole. A reestablishment of what's correct and orderly and what's unacceptable, of what was going on in Europe at the time. And so that following decade after World War II, things settled down, things became maybe a little easier, and we took advantage of them, and that bleeds in. Grace builds on nature. We've said it, so many times. Grace builds on nature. And if naturally we're turning towards the inward, turning towards the physical, the self-satisfying, the sensational, the sensation of the appetite, unsatiable appetite, I should say, cravings of happiness and, perhaps. So then in comes Vatican II, in comes the changes. And again, I can only make assumptions. I didn't live through the 1950s or 60s. But we can also trace back historically and see that the things that were accepted publicly, and I say publicly even in the church or in the state, were certainly not the things that were publicly accepted these days. Certainly the scandals and ridiculously offensive masses and clerics and positions that were being held and promoted that are against the hearts, against the morals of the majority, and being pushed as normal, that was not happening in the 1950s, at least not publicly. Was it happening behind closed doors? Yeah, all of that was. Was it happening behind closed hearts? Yeah, absolutely it was. So I feel personally that kind of led to the 1960s. It kind of led to what happened in our society. It kind of led to what happened in our church. The 1970s pretty much ensued even more so, went off the rails in the 1970s. The worst liturgical abuses, clown masses, chocolate chip cookies being used as host, liturgical dance, horrible music. It was, society went down, and so did the church at that point. You started to see the shuttering of the churches, the seminaries, the vocations. All of that led to the 1980s, which led to more scandals in the church. The church letting anybody in, with a vocation, perhaps. Maybe there was, ulterior motives of some of these men that entered the church that later led to, so many abuses. Absolutely. So we can judge that. We can look at that. We can look and see, like, okay, here's the moral breakdown of the church during the 1970s, during the 1980s. Society went the same direction. Led to the 90s, to maybe a sort of a distaste people starting to kind of, more of a move back to a conservative, seeing so much liberalization in the 70s and the 80s. Maybe, we started to see a reeling back in towards the 1990s. 2000s brought, renewal. Pope Benedict XVI, God rest his soul. I'm not saying he was some perfect pope. There's argument about, some of his involvement in Vatican II. But at the end of the day, he brought reverence. He brought some liturgical normalcy back to the church, into his primacy. So we started to see a renewal, a regeneration, a regrowth. But we had entered into a threshold uncharted before. I mean, I think you could compare it almost to the technology advancements. The technology advancements in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s were exponential. Technology doubling every 6 months. Was that happening in the church? Was the liberalization during the 60s, 70s, and 80s exponentially growing and the fruits of them, falling off the tree, rotting, so that finally we have a disgust and a distaste by the end of the 90s and the early 2000s. The renewal of the traditional Latin Mass, of course, it was still there. 1988 brought about the Ecclesia Dei Commission. So yes, the Society of St. Pius X went their way. The Ecclesia Dei with Fraternity of St. Peter, Institute of Christ the King, and others went the other. But the Latin Mass, maintained, and it grew. Some would say that when we hit 2000s, when another correction came, so you had, the pandemic of 2020, call it what you want. Church is unavailable, especially local diocesan churches, unavailable for faithful to go to Mass on Sunday. Everyone living in fear, sheltered, masked up. And what did people do? They went online. They went online for church to find the availability of streaming. And what they found was the traditional Latin Mass. So through this technology, through this advancement, a renewal now. So then, by 2020, you have this huge spike in questions about the Latin Mass. It had been murmuring. It hadn't quite exploded like across the board publicly. There was always your supporters, always the existence. But 2020, I think, changed the game. And once you enter through that threshold, you just don't go back. Once people actually see the beauty and the richness of the traditions of the church, I've been insulted saying, well, it's not the Mass. I agree, it's not just the Mass. It is everything relative to the Mass and tradition. Traditionis Custodes was an attack on the Latin Mass. But just like Vatican II, was stated it was non-dogmatic, Traditionis Custodes was not just it was. It was just an attack on the Latin Mass. But it didn't stop there. Because all of these priests and bishops that are now laying down the law are the priests and bishops that were ordained after Vatican II. Pope Francis, Pope Leo, local bishops under the age of 70, our local bishop, formed after Vatican II, formed after the breakdown of the Mass, the breakdown of theology. So what does that mean? Where does that leave us? Well, now we're at a tug of war. Because you have a great not majority, but a great number of Catholics who have learned the richness of what the faith truly is. It's not just the Mass. It is everything associated with the traditions of our church. The Mass was the tip of the iceberg. Obviously the peak and source and summit of our faith, but it's connected to everything underneath. It's connected to reverence and orthodoxy and prayer, altar rails, rosaries, kneeling, Eucharistic ministers, altar girls, whatever. All of these other things are novelties. They came in. And none of these things were actually supposed to have been changed. Gregorian chant was still supposed to be the preferred music of the Mass, the liturgy. Latin, the preferred language. Communion on the tongue, certainly. Communion in the hands is an abuse. It's allowed, but it was never anything defined. But now the exception has become the law or the rule. And so here we are trying to unravel the exceptions that these bishops have just assumed and put into place as regular practice. And so when you have Catholics now duly formed who do not feel worthy to receive our Lord in their hand and just consume him like anything else. Me personally, I don't receive in the hands, never have received in the hands. I kneel before the Blessed Sacrament when I receive. I'm no better than anybody else. I just recognize my own unworthiness. I don't want to touch him. I don't want to have this be like some other regular, ordinary meal, a potato chip, a hamburger that I feed myself upon. I want to be fed. I want to be fed by our Lord. I do not want to feed myself. We feed ourselves every day way too much. We feed ourselves through our pride and subsequent sin that we commit. So on this one occasion, once a week or however often I can get or you can get, make it different. Make it more special. Why wouldn't you? Why would that be discouraged? I heard something the other day. It was in regards to Father Rippinger, of course, one of the top exorcists in our country, if not in the world, who's very public about his work. But he mentions that with those that he has dealt with who are possessed, there is a much more reaction of the demons to the traditional Latin Mass as opposed to the Novus Ordo. He said that the reaction to the consecration of the Blessed Sacrament during either Mass is the same, but at the very start of the traditional Latin Mass, the demons are already reacting in a more reactive manner, a more aggressive manner. The Latin, the reverence, the prayers, the overall sense of holiness that simply lacks in your average Novus Ordo Mass. So what does that mean? He's also said that, and other exorcists have confirmed that sometimes Latin must be used. Latin prayers must be used to expel the demons. It's the language that's been used for almost 2,000 years. It was the Mass that was used for almost 2,000 years. It existed. It has roots. It has consistency. Foundationally, it is superb as a whole. It's a better way. I can pray the rosary walking down the street, eating some popcorn or a hamburger, walking my dog, or I can light a candle before a crucifix and use a scriptural rosary guidebook, and there's going to be a better way to pray the rosary. It doesn't mean that one's invalid and one's wrong and one's evil and one's right. It means there's a better way. There's formal blessings, there are informal blessings. If you've ever had anything blessed by a priest, you know that he can take that object and he can put his hand over it and bless it, and it's blessed. Or he can go through a full formal prayer, scapular especially. There's a very long blessing for a scapular, if done in the traditional manner. Or there's the sprinkling of holy water and the waving of the hand. And is it blessed? Yeah, it's blessed, but there's a better way. There's a better way. I get a lot of kickback on that. Yes, our Lord is there in both Masses. If the form, the intention, and the matter is present for either Mass, then our Lord's there. And who am I to not stand with our Lord? If he can go through and suffer, I can go through and suffer. Yes, there's a fine line between scandal and a problem for your faith if you're going to something that is remotely unorthodox, irreverent, or perhaps even scandalous. But I would say your average Novus Ordo Mass, I can say, because I've done it, I can stomach my way through. And that's a horrible thing to have to say about our Mass. But sadly, that's what the abuses have done. I've never had to stomach a traditional Latin Mass. I've never had to hold my nose at strange novelties by the priest or the faithful during a traditional Latin Mass. That tells you something right there. It tells you something. But there are very reverent Novus Ordo Masses, very holy priests celebrating those Novus Ordo Masses that do not have scandal, do not have irreverency or anything unorthodox. but they're still lacking certain elements. In a lot of cases, not every case, but that goes back to an argument about the change to the liturgy in the first place. Why was it changed? What was the meaning? What was the results? Like, let's look back. Okay, well, we made this change. Now we have this result. What was the reasoning? Are most of the results bad? I say yes. That can be argued. But for the sake of argument's sake, if most of the results you see from this liturgical change, why are we pursuing it? How do we justify the number of priests left their vocations? The number of faithful that do not believe? In traditional Latin Mass circles, you're pushing 100% of your faithful polled who believe in the real presence. At your average Novus Ordo, as spoken even by our bishops and priests publicly, it's around 70% that do not believe. How can you justify that? I don't know. Just a guy in the pew. And I guess we're out of time. But just a few more things to think about. We'll keep paying attention. We'll see what happens. There are some hierarchy now saying that the excommunications were not warranted and were not valid. And of course, hierarchy is still digging in and saying, of course, they're valid. I'm just a guy in the middle. I support my local priest. I support all those priests that are working, that are grinding, that are trying to teach the faith purely, traditionally. Not meaning that it has to be the traditional Latin Mass, but are truly teaching the faith. They're not trying to be modernist, not trying to invent new novelties, not trying to be all about them, but truly teaching the faith. I stand there. I understand the Society of St. Pius X's position. I've been very close to them. I support what they're about. Right now, I'm confused. Because me personally, like I said before, if I was told that I couldn't continue the ministries that I run, I don't say ministries, the apostolates that I run, the work that I do, under pain of excommunication, if I didn't, me personally, I couldn't pursue. I couldn't do that. So, not saying I'm right or I'm wrong. I don't know enough. I'm just trying to save my soul. You're trying to save your soul. And please God, our leaders and our bishops will focus on that as well. Stay away from politics. Stay away from self-promotion and acknowledgement in media, and focus on the business of saving souls. Until next time, God bless.
Comfort is the silent killer. Time to get uncomfortable.
Die to sin, die to self, live for God. Will you be ready?